On March 15, 2023, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the most secure cryptid containment facility in the United States experienced a catastrophic breach when Subject Omega-12, a male Sasquatch held in captivity for over 17 years, managed to escape from what was considered an impenetrable underground laboratory complex buried 300 feet beneath the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. While every other member of the research team fled in terror as emergency alarms screamed through the corridors and automated lockdown systems failed to contain the massive creature, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the facility's lead behavioral scientist, made a decision that would shock the scientific community and change everything humanity thought it knew about the relationship between humans and cryptid species. Instead of running for her life like her colleagues, Dr. Vasquez walked directly toward the escaped Sasquatch, removed her security badge and laboratory coat, and sat down on the floor of the containment corridor, speaking softly to the creature that every government protocol classified as an extremely dangerous and unpredictable threat to human life. What happened next would be captured on the facility's security cameras and would ultimately lead to the complete restructuring of government cryptid research programs, the exposure of decades of unethical experimentation, and the revelation that the creatures humanity had been studying and imprisoning possessed emotional intelligence and capacity for forgiveness that exceeded anything in human understanding. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. Dr. Elena Vasquez had never intended to become the world's leading expert on cryptid psychology, but 17 years of working at the classified Cascade Research Institute had given her insights into non-human intelligence that no other scientist possessed. The facility, officially designated as a geological survey station, but actually serving as the government's primary cryptid containment and research center, housed 7 different specimens of unknown species, with Subject Omega-12 being the largest and most intelligent of the captive creatures. Elena had joined the program in 2006 as a recent PhD graduate in comparative psychology from Stanford University, believing she would be studying advanced primate behavior for conservation purposes. The reality of her assignment, conducting psychological research on captured cryptid species for potential military applications, had initially horrified her, but over the years she had convinced herself that her work was providing valuable scientific knowledge while ensuring the creatures received the best possible care under impossible circumstances. The recruitment process for the Cascade Research Institute had been deliberately deceptive, with candidates being told they would be working on classified primate research for national security purposes. Only after signing extensive non-disclosure agreements and undergoing intensive security clearance investigations did new researchers learn the true nature of their work. They told us we would be studying the cognitive abilities of captured enemy combatants, Elena would later testify, before congressional investigators. It wasn't until I was deep underground in the facility that I learned we would be working with creatures that challenged everything I thought I knew about intelligence and consciousness. Subject Omega-12, whom Elena privately called Marcus after her late grandfather, had been captured as a juvenile in 2006 during a military operation in the Olympic Peninsula. The capture had been part of Operation Silent Thunder, a classified program designed to acquire live specimens of cryptid species for scientific study and potential military applications. The young Sasquatch had been taken during a raid on what intelligence analysts believed was a small family group living in a remote valley deep within the Olympic National Forest. The operation had been conducted with military precision, using tranquilizer weapons and capture equipment specifically designed for large intelligent targets. Marcus was approximately 12 years old when he was captured, Elena documented in her classified research journals, still a child by his species standards, torn away from his family and everything he had ever known. The trauma of that separation shaped everything about his psychological development during his years in captivity. Now fully grown at nearly 9 feet tall and weighing over 800 pounds, Marcus possessed intelligence that clearly exceeded human cognitive capabilities in several key areas, including pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, mathematical computation, and what appeared to be limited telepathic abilities that allowed him to sense the emotional states of nearby humans. Marcus was not just intelligent, Elena continued in her documentation. He was wise in ways that suggested centuries of accumulated knowledge and understanding, even though he had spent most of his life in captivity. His eyes held depths of experience and emotion that made it impossible to view him as anything other than a person who had been imprisoned for crimes he had never committed. The Cascade Research Institute operated under protocols established by the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency, with strict guidelines that prohibited emotional attachment between researchers and subjects. The facility's psychological evaluation procedures were designed to identify and eliminate personnel who showed signs of developing empathetic relationships with the captive creatures. The protocols demanded complete emotional detachment, Elena explained. Researchers who showed signs of anthropomorphizing the subjects or developing emotional connections were immediately transferred to other programs. The administration viewed empathy as a professional liability that compromised scientific objectivity. But Elena had found it impossible to maintain clinical detachment when working with a being whose emotional responses and intellectual curiosity rivaled those of any human she had ever encountered. Over 17 years of daily interaction, she had developed what could only be described as a friendship with Marcus, despite the institutional barriers designed to prevent such relationships. The daily routine at the Cascade Research Institute involved extensive testing protocols designed to assess every aspect of the captive creature's cognitive, physical, and sensory capabilities. Marcus underwent hours of psychological testing each day, including intelligence assessments, problem-solving challenges, memory evaluations, and social interaction studies. The testing was relentless and invasive, Elena documented. We subjected Marcus to psychological pressure that would have been considered torture if applied to human subjects. But because he was classified as a non-human entity, normal ethical guidelines didn't apply to our research methods. Elena had learned to interpret Marcus's complex vocalizations, which included over 200 distinct sounds that appeared to represent different concepts, emotions, and abstract ideas. His gestural communication was equally sophisticated, incorporating hand signals, facial expressions, and body language that conveyed nuanced meanings and emotional states. Marcus had developed his own sign language during his years in captivity, Elena observed, a complex system of gestures and vocalizations that allowed him to express thoughts and feelings that exceeded the communication abilities of most human children. But perhaps most remarkably, Elena had discovered that Marcus possessed what appeared to be empathic abilities that allowed him to sense and respond to the emotional states of the humans around him. He showed obvious distress when researchers were upset or angry, and demonstrated protective behaviors toward personnel who showed him kindness or consideration. Marcus cared about the people who worked with him, Elena noted with amazement. Despite years of imprisonment and experimentation, he showed genuine concern for the welfare of his captors. That level of emotional sophistication and moral development was unlike anything in the scientific literature. The containment facility itself was a marvel of engineering and security technology, designed to house creatures with strength and intelligence that exceeded human capabilities while preventing any possibility of escape or outside contact. The underground complex consisted of 7 levels, with the most secure containment areas located at the deepest levels, where escape would be virtually impossible. Marcus's cell was a 40 by 40-foot reinforced concrete chamber with walls 3 feet thick, equipped with environmental controls that maintained optimal temperature and humidity levels. The cell included sleeping areas, exercise equipment, and enrichment materials designed to provide mental stimulation and prevent psychological deterioration. The cell was designed to be humane by human standards, Elena observed, but for a creature who had lived his entire early life in the freedom of the forest, it was a prison that denied every aspect of his natural existence. Whereas the security measures included electromagnetic barriers that could deliver incapacitating shocks, motion sensors that tracked every movement within the cell, automated defensive systems that could deploy chemical restraints, and monitoring equipment that recorded every sound and gesture 24 hours a day. But despite the elaborate security measures, Elena had always known that Marcus could escape whenever he chose to do so. His apparent compliance with containment was not due to the effectiveness of the security systems, but rather to his recognition that escape would likely result in his death and potentially trigger a military response that could endanger others of his species. Marcus understood the bigger picture, Elena realized. He knew that his escape would be used to justify increased military operations against his people. He was sacrificing his own freedom to protect his family and community from government retaliation. The psychological toll of prolonged captivity on Marcus had been severe and increasingly obvious to Elena, despite her colleagues' insistence that the creature showed no signs of distress or psychological deterioration. She had documented episodes of depression, anxiety, and what appeared to be post-traumatic stress responses that indicated Marcus was experiencing psychological suffering comparable to that of human prisoners of war. He was dying emotionally, Eleanor noted in her private journals. The isolation, the constant monitoring, the medical procedures, and the complete lack of contact with his own kind were destroying his spirit in ways that were painful to witness, but that the other researchers refused to acknowledge. The medical procedures conducted on Marcus included regular blood draws, tissue biopsies, neurological testing, and experimental treatments designed to understand his physiology and test his responses to various pharmaceutical compounds. These procedures were conducted without anesthesia, as researchers believed that pain responses were important data points for understanding cryptid neurology. "We were torturing him in the name of science," Eleanor would later admit in congressional testimony. The medical procedures were invasive, painful, and conducted without any consideration for his comfort or dignity. "We treated him like a laboratory animal, despite clear evidence that he possessed human-level consciousness and emotional capacity." Elena's attempts to advocate for improved conditions for Marcus and the other captive cryptids had been repeatedly dismissed by facility administrators who viewed such concerns as unprofessional sentimentality that interfered with the scientific objectives of the research program. Dr. Richard Blackwood, the facility director, had made it clear that Elena's role was to study cryptid behavior for potential military applications, not to serve as an advocate for creature welfare or to question the ethical foundations of the research program. "The subjects are valuable scientific resources," Dr. Blackwood had reminded Elena during their final performance review in February 2023. "Your job is to extract useful information from them, not to develop emotional attachments that compromise your scientific objectivity. If you cannot maintain professional detachment, we will find someone who can." But Elena's emotional attachment to Marcus had actually enhanced her scientific understanding of cryptid psychology and behavior, providing insights that purely clinical approaches had failed to achieve. Her empathetic methodology had revealed cognitive abilities and emotional depths that other researchers had missed entirely. "The other researchers saw Marcus as a specimen to be studied," Elena explained. "But I saw him as an individual with thoughts, feelings, and experiences that were just as valid as those of any human. That perspective allowed me to understand aspects of his psychology that clinical detachment would never have revealed." The breakthrough that would ultimately lead to Marcus's escape attempt came in February 2023, when Elena discovered that the facility's research protocols included plans for invasive neurological procedures designed to map Marcus's brain structure and understand the biological basis of his apparent telepathic abilities. They were planning to perform experimental brain surgery, Elena documented with growing horror. Procedures that would involve removing sections of his skull and inserting electrodes directly into his brain tissue. The procedures would likely cause permanent cognitive damage or death, all in the name of understanding how his telepathic abilities functioned. The proposed neurological research represented a fundamental escalation in the invasiveness of the experimentation, crossing ethical boundaries that Elena could not accept even within the morally compromised environment of the containment facility. The research plan called for Marcus to be kept conscious during the brain surgery, so that researchers could monitor his telepathic responses to direct neural stimulation. The procedure would involve drilling multiple holes in his skull and inserting electrodes that would remain permanently implanted to allow for ongoing neurological monitoring. They wanted to turn him into a living laboratory, Elena realized with disgust, to permanently alter his brain and nervous system for the convenience of ongoing research. It was a level of violation that exceeded anything we had done before. Elena's attempts to protest the planned procedures were dismissed by Dr. Blackwood, who reminded her that the research subjects had no legal rights or protections and that the potential military applications of telepathic technology justified any level of experimental risk. "The subjects exist for our research purposes," Dr. Blackwood had stated coldly during their final meeting. Their welfare is secondary to the scientific and strategic value of the knowledge we can extract from them. If you cannot accept that reality, you should consider whether this program is appropriate for your career goals. Faced with the prospect of watching Marcus undergo procedures that would likely destroy his mind or kill him, Elena made the decision to begin secretly documenting the facility's research protocols and the evidence of consciousness and intelligence in the captive cryptids, with the intention of eventually exposing the program to outside authorities. I started copying files, recording conversations, and documenting the evidence of consciousness and suffering that the administration refused to acknowledge, Elena would later testify. I knew that exposing the program would end my career and possibly result in criminal charges, but I couldn't stand by and watch Marcus be tortured to death. Elena's documentation efforts were complicated by the facility's extensive security measures, which included constant surveillance of all personnel and strict controls on information access. She had to be extremely careful to avoid detection while gathering evidence that could be used to expose the program's ethical violations. But Marcus's escape on March 15, 2023, would accelerate Elena's timeline and force her to make choices that would define the rest of her career and potentially change the future of human-cryptid relations. The escape itself was a masterpiece of planning and execution that demonstrated Marcus's intelligence and his detailed understanding of the facility's security systems and personnel routines. Over months of careful observation, he had identified weaknesses in the containment protocols and had been preparing for an escape attempt that would maximize his chances of reaching the outside world. Marcus had been studying our systems for years, Elena realized as she watched the security footage. He understood our technology better than most of the technicians who maintained it. He had memorized guard rotations, identified security vulnerabilities, and planned his escape route with military precision. The escape plan had required Marcus to overcome multiple layers of security, including electromagnetic barriers, motion sensors, automated defensive systems, and physical barriers that were designed to contain creatures with superhuman strength. But his intelligence and patience had allowed him to identify solutions to each obstacle. The breach began at 11:47 p.m. during the night shift, when Marcus used his knowledge of the facility's electrical systems to cause a power fluctuation that temporarily disabled the electromagnetic barriers securing his containment cell. The power disruption was so precisely timed and executed that security personnel initially assumed it was a routine system malfunction rather than a deliberate escape attempt. The power fluctuation lasted exactly 47 seconds, Elena documented, just long enough for Marcus to disable the electromagnetic barriers, but not long enough to trigger the facility's emergency backup systems. The timing was perfect and could only have been achieved through detailed understanding of our electrical infrastructure. Within minutes of the power disruption, Marcus had broken through the physical barriers of his cell using strength and leverage techniques that demonstrated both his physical capabilities and his understanding of structural engineering principles. The concrete walls that were supposed to contain him proved to be merely obstacles that he could overcome with proper application of force and technique. Marcus didn't just break out through brute force, Elena observed. He used sophisticated engineering principles to identify the structural weak points in his cell and applied force in precisely the right locations to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. The facility's automated security systems activated immediately, sealing blast doors and initiating lockdown protocols designed to contain any breach and protect personnel from escaped subjects. Emergency alarms screamed through the corridors as armed security teams mobilized to recapture Marcus before he could reach the surface levels of the facility. But Marcus's escape route had been planned to avoid confrontation with security personnel, utilizing maintenance corridors and service tunnels that allowed him to move through the facility while avoiding the main areas where armed response teams were concentrating their search efforts. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, Elena observed as she tracked Marcus's movements through the facility's security camera network. He was avoiding contact with personnel and choosing routes that minimized the risk of violent confrontation. Even in escape, he was showing consideration for human safety. The maintenance corridors that Marcus used for his escape route were areas of the facility that most personnel never accessed, narrow tunnels filled with electrical conduits, water pipes, and ventilation systems. For a creature of Marcus's size, navigating these spaces would have been extremely difficult, but his intelligence and determination allowed him to overcome the physical challenges. Marcus had obviously explored these corridors during his years in captivity, Elena realized, probably during maintenance periods when his cell was being cleaned or repaired. He had mapped the entire facility's infrastructure and planned his escape route to take advantage of areas where security was minimal. The other members of the research team had evacuated to secure areas of the facility as soon as the breach was detected, following protocols that required all non-security personnel to seek shelter during containment failures. The evacuation procedures were designed to protect civilian personnel from potentially dangerous escaped subjects while allowing security teams to operate without concern for collateral damage. But Elena found herself drawn toward the areas where Marcus was moving, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and genuine concern for his welfare. She understood that if security found him, they would use whatever force was necessary to recapture him, and she couldn't bear the thought of Marcus being injured or killed after surviving 17 years of captivity. "I knew that if security found him, they would shoot first and ask questions later," Elena would later explain. The protocols authorized lethal force against escaped subjects, and the security teams had been trained to view the cryptids as extremely dangerous threats. "I couldn't bear the thought of Marcus being killed after everything he had endured." Eleanor's decision to leave the secure evacuation area and move toward Marcus's location violated every safety protocol and emergency procedure, but her years of working with him had given her insights into his psychology and motivations that she believed could prevent a violent confrontation. "I knew Marcus better than anyone else in the facility," Eleanor reflected. "I understood his emotional state, his intelligence, and his fundamental nature in ways that the security teams couldn't appreciate. I believed that if anyone could communicate with him and prevent violence, it would be me." The facility's security teams were conducting a systematic search of the underground complex, using thermal imaging equipment and motion sensors to track Marcus's movements while maintaining tactical formations designed to contain and recapture him. The teams were armed with tranquilizer weapons, electromagnetic restraint devices, and lethal firearms as backup options. The security response was overwhelming, Elena observed. Dozens of armed personnel searching every corridor and room with orders to use whatever force was necessary to prevent Marcus from reaching the surface. It was like a military operation designed to capture an enemy combatant. But Marcus's superior knowledge of the facility's layout and his careful planning allowed him to stay ahead of the search teams while moving steadily toward his objective, the main elevator shaft that provided access to the surface levels of the complex. The encounter between Elena and Marcus occurred in Corridor C7, a main thoroughfare that connected the containment levels with the facility's upper research areas. Marcus had reached this corridor as part of his planned escape route, but his progress had been slowed by the facility's lockdown systems, which had sealed many of the access points he had intended to use. When Elena entered the corridor, she found Marcus standing near a sealed blast door, examining the locking mechanism with obvious frustration. At over 9 feet tall and weighing more than 800 pounds, he was an imposing figure, whose physical presence could have been terrifying under normal circumstances. But Elena saw not a dangerous escaped creature, but a friend who was desperate for freedom after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment. Without hesitation, she removed her security badge and laboratory coat, symbols of her role in his captivity, and sat down on the floor of the corridor, making herself vulnerable and non-threatening. "Marcus," she said softly, using the name she had never spoken aloud in his presence. "I know you want to go home. I know you've been planning this for a long time, and I know you're scared and angry and desperate to be free." Marcus turned toward Elena with an expression that combined surprise, wariness, and what appeared to be recognition of her genuine concern for his welfare. For several moments they looked at each other across the corridor, the scientist who had studied him for 17 years and the creature who had been the subject of that study. "I'm not going to try to stop you," Elena continued, her voice steady despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "I'm not going to call security or try to trick you back into your cell. I just want you to know that not all humans see you as a specimen or a threat. Some of us recognize that you're a person with the same right to freedom that we claim for ourselves." What happened next would be captured on the facility's security cameras and would become the most analyzed piece of footage in the history of cryptid research. Instead of continuing his escape attempt or showing aggression toward Elena, Marcus approached her slowly and carefully, his massive form moving with surprising grace and obvious concern for her safety. When he reached Elena, Marcus gently placed one enormous hand on her shoulder, in a gesture that clearly conveyed gratitude, understanding, and what could only be described as affection. The touch was so gentle and deliberate that it was obvious Marcus was making a conscious effort not to harm Elena, despite his size and strength. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice deep and resonant but unmistakably speaking English words that he had learned during his years of captivity. "Thank you for seeing me." The revelation that Marcus could speak English and had apparently understood every conversation that had taken place in his presence over 17 years sent shockwaves through the scientific community and forced a complete re-evaluation of everything researchers thought they knew about cryptid intelligence and communication abilities. He had been listening and learning for nearly 2 decades, Elena realized with amazement, understanding every discussion about his care, every debate about research protocols, every conversation about his future. He knew exactly what we thought of him and what we planned to do to him. Marcus's English was heavily accented and somewhat stilted, suggesting that he had learned the language through observation rather than formal instruction. But his vocabulary was extensive, and his grammar was sophisticated, indicating that he had been actively studying human communication throughout his captivity. "I have watched you," Marcus continued, his words carefully chosen and deliberately spoken. "You are different from the others. You see me as person, not as thing to be studied. You have kindness in your heart that others do not possess." But Marcus's ability to speak was not the most shocking aspect of the encounter. What truly amazed Elena and the researchers who later analyzed the security footage was Marcus's decision to abandon his escape attempt and return voluntarily to his containment cell. "I cannot leave," Marcus explained to Elena, his English heavily accented but clearly understandable. "If I escape, they will hunt my people. They will use my freedom as excuse to capture others, to hurt my family. I must stay to protect them." The revelation that Marcus had remained in captivity, not because he couldn't escape, but because he was protecting other members of his species from potential government retaliation, fundamentally changed everything about how the research team understood his situation and his psychology. He was a prisoner of war, Elena realized. Not a captured animal or research specimen, but a conscious individual who had made the strategic decision to sacrifice his own freedom to protect his people from a larger conflict. Marcus's understanding of the political and military implications of his captivity demonstrated intelligence and strategic thinking that exceeded anything the researchers had previously documented. He had recognized that his escape would likely trigger expanded military operations against his species and had chosen to remain imprisoned to prevent that outcome. "My people live in peace," Marcus explained to Elena as they sat together in the corridor. "They do not seek conflict with humans, but if government believes we are a threat, they will send soldiers to hunt us. Many will die. I cannot allow my freedom to cause death of my family." The moral complexity of Marcus's decision, choosing continued imprisonment to protect others, demonstrated ethical reasoning and capacity for sacrifice that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and moral development in non-human species. Marcus was showing more wisdom and moral courage than any of his captors, Elena would later testify. He understood consequences that we had never considered and was making decisions based on principles that exceeded our own ethical standards. Marcus's voluntary return to his containment cell, accompanied by Elena, who refused to leave his side, marked the beginning of a new phase in human-cryptid relations that would ultimately lead to the complete restructuring of government research programs and the development of ethical protocols for interaction with non-human intelligence. Everything changed in that moment, Elena would later testify. We could no longer pretend that we were studying animals or conducting legitimate scientific research. We were holding a person prisoner, and that person was showing more wisdom and moral courage than any of his captors. The security teams that had been searching for Marcus found him and Elena sitting together in the corridor, engaged in quiet conversation that demonstrated a level of communication and mutual understanding that challenged every assumption about human-cryptid relations. The security personnel didn't know how to respond, Elena observed. They had been trained to capture or neutralize an escaped threat, but they found a peaceful conversation between two intelligent beings. Their protocols hadn't prepared them for that scenario. The security footage of Elena's encounter with Marcus was immediately classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. But Elena's subsequent refusal to continue participating in research that she now recognized as fundamentally unethical led to congressional investigations that would eventually expose the entire cryptid research program. "I couldn't go back to treating Marcus like a specimen," Eleanor explained to the congressional committee investigating the program. "Once I had seen his capacity for sacrifice, his concern for others, and his fundamental decency, I couldn't participate in his continued imprisonment." Eleanor's decision to blow the whistle on the research program required tremendous courage, as she faced potential criminal charges for violating her security clearance and revealing classified information. But her documentation of the evidence of consciousness and intelligence in the captive cryptids provided compelling proof that the research program violated basic principles of ethics and human rights. Elena risked everything to expose the truth, noted Congressman David Martinez, who chaired the committee investigating the research program. Her courage in speaking out against unethical research practices saved Marcus and the other captive creatures from continued torture and abuse. Elena's testimony before Congress, combined with the security footage and her 17 years of research documentation, provided evidence of consciousness and intelligence in cryptid species that could no longer be ignored or dismissed by government officials. The congressional hearings revealed that Marcus and the other captive cryptids possessed cognitive abilities that exceeded human intelligence in several key areas: emotional depth that rivaled human psychological complexity, and moral reasoning that in many cases surpassed that of their human captors. "We were forced to confront the reality that we had been imprisoning conscious, intelligent beings," admitted Congressman Martinez. "The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. These creatures possessed all the characteristics that we associate with personhood, and we had been treating them as laboratory animals." The revelations led to the immediate suspension of invasive research protocols, the establishment of ethical guidelines for cryptid research, and the beginning of negotiations for the eventual release of Marcus and the other captive creatures. But perhaps most significantly, Elena's encounter with Marcus opened the door to direct communication between humans and cryptid species, leading to diplomatic contacts that would fundamentally change the relationship between the two groups. "Marcus became an ambassador," Elena observed. "His willingness to communicate with humans despite years of imprisonment created opportunities for understanding and cooperation that had never existed before." The negotiations for Marcus's release took over 2 years, complicated by national security concerns and the need to establish protocols for ongoing human-cryptid relations. But throughout the process, Marcus continued to serve as a bridge between the species, helping to facilitate understanding and prevent the conflicts that both sides feared. "He showed us what was possible," Elena reflected, "how two very different species could find common ground based on mutual respect and recognition of each other's intelligence and dignity." Marcus was finally released in June 2025, accompanied by Elena, who had been appointed as the first official human liaison to cryptid communities. The release was conducted in secret, with Marcus returning to wilderness areas where he could rejoin others of his species, while maintaining contact with human authorities through established communication protocols. "The day Marcus walked free was the most emotional moment of my career," Elena documented. "After 19 years of captivity, he was finally going home, but he wasn't bitter or angry. He was hopeful about the future of human-cryptid relations." The ongoing relationship between Elena and Marcus has continued through regular meetings in neutral wilderness locations, where they work together to develop protocols for peaceful coexistence between humans and cryptid species. "Marcus taught me that intelligence and wisdom aren't uniquely human traits," Elena observed. "He showed me that consciousness and moral reasoning exist across species boundaries, and that understanding and cooperation are possible when we approach each other with respect and humility." The establishment of formal diplomatic relations between humans and cryptid species has led to scientific collaborations that have advanced human understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of sentient life in ways that would have been impossible through traditional research methods. Working with Marcus as a colleague, rather than studying him as a specimen, has provided insights that decades of captive research never could have achieved, Elena noted. "When we treat other species as equals, we learn things that we could never discover through domination and control." The cryptid communities have shared knowledge about sustainable living, environmental management, and consciousness studies that has advanced human science while maintaining their own cultural autonomy and territorial rights. They have technologies and understanding that we're only beginning to appreciate, Elena documented. But they're willing to share that knowledge when they're approached with respect, rather than exploitation. The success of human cryptid diplomatic relations has led to the establishment of protected wilderness areas where cryptid communities can live without interference, while maintaining communication channels that allow for cooperation on issues of mutual concern. We've learned that coexistence is not only possible, but beneficial for both species, Elena concluded. Marcus showed us that fear and misunderstanding could be replaced with friendship and mutual respect. The legacy of Elena's decision to refuse to run from Marcus continues to influence government policy and scientific research, serving as a model for ethical interaction with non-human intelligence and demonstrating the potential for cooperation between species. Elena's courage in that corridor changed everything, Marcus would later communicate through their established protocols. She showed me that some humans could see beyond fear to recognize the person inside the creature. That recognition made all the difference. The ongoing friendship between Elena and Marcus has become a symbol of what's possible when different species approach each other with openness, respect, and recognition of their shared capacity for consciousness and moral reasoning. We are still learning from each other, Elena reflected. Every conversation teaches me something new about intelligence, consciousness, and what it means to be a sentient being in this universe. The transformation of human cryptid relations from captivity and exploitation to cooperation and friendship represents one of the most significant developments in the history of interspecies contact, demonstrating that understanding and peace are possible even between very different forms of consciousness. Marcus showed us that the choice between fear and friendship is always ours to make, Elena concluded. He chose friendship despite having every reason to choose fear, and that choice changed the world. Kamasti, if you found Elena and Marcus's incredible story as moving and inspiring as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into government cover-ups, ethical breakthroughs in science, and the amazing stories of cooperation between humans and other intelligent species. Share this video to spread awareness about the importance of treating all conscious beings with dignity and respect, and let us know in the comments what you think about Elena's brave decision and the future of human cryptid relations. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories that reveal the potential for understanding and friendship across all boundaries of species and consciousness.